When you did the In Utero sessions, you did, I think, 6 songs, but only one of them had vocals. Is this correct?
Correct.
Do you remember why you guys didn't record vocals for the other 5 songs you guys did for the In Utero sessions?
Kurt couldn't be bothered. Just didn't want to. He did one vocal and then said, all right, we're done.
Really?
That was it. Now, they booked 2 days at least, and the whole first day, nobody showed up.
Really?
I basically was sitting in the studio. If I remember correctly, it was either the first... When they finally showed up, it was evening. Whether there was an entire day when they didn't show up, I honestly don't remember. I may be exaggerating. But I do know they kind of annoyed me because I expected them to show up, on time, eager to record, like most people were, but they didn't. When they finally showed up, they banged through 6 songs, and it was the only time I recorded Dave Grohl in the studio. And there's a funny story about this, which was all the time I'd been working in this building for 5 years as reciprocal recording and for 2 years as word-of-mouth recording. We never had, we had one noise complaint from the police in like 1987 or something like that. Mm-hmm. Never again until I had Dave Grohl playing drums in the building because he was so loud. And police actually came to the door, and I tried to explain to them, I've got Nirvana in here, and they didn't really care who it was. Yeah. They just said, can you keep it down a little? But, I think we had one more song to record or something, and, that was that. So that was a funny thing about the In Utero demo, was the police coming and complaining about the noise because, to this day, I don't think there's been another noise complaint. And that's been a studio ever since then. And it was a studio since the 70s, and it just never got noise complaints. So, go figure.
It's funny.
Whatever passed for mixing, again, took place very quickly. I know I'm thinking probably Kurt showed up the next day to do the vocals, and Courtney was there, and so was Francis, because he had the baby on his lap at one point, which is why you hear a baby crying in the middle of the song.
Which song is this?
Rape Me.
This is the demo that you did for Rape Me?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the only song from those 6 that has a vocal. Yeah, there's not even a guide vocal. So, of course, I didn't, he told me the titles at the time, such as they were, and it's unfortunate, really, because without a vocal, they're not very interesting. I did what mix I could of Rape Me for the box set, and much later for the deluxe In Utero reissue, they let me remix a couple of other things, including a couple of Brazil recordings that they did with Craig Montgomery.
Oh, you were involved with those ones too?
Yes, there's 2, I think, that I remixed that are on. For some reason, we're not on the box set, so I remixed those, and those are on the In Utero Deluxe CD edition. So I think the 2 or 3 of the instrumental tunes from the In Utero demo, I mixed those. This is like much, much later. And 2 of the Brazil recordings, I remixed those. So that stuff is on the In Utero Deluxe reissue, which the Rape Me version should have been used there too, but because they'd already used it on the box set, they didn't use it on the In Utero reissue. This stuff has all been scattered all over the place. It's unfortunate. Like all the Dale demo stuff, that should be in one place. Mm-hmm. But, some of it's on Bleach, some of it's on INCESTICIDE, some of it's on the box set. It's just how these things ended up.
Did they approach you independently to do the In Utero demos, or was it facilitated through a label?
Some representative called. I don't think it was the label. Somebody from whatever management they had at the time, I don't know who it was, called to book the time. And in fact, they initially booked the time and then canceled it because Francis was born, and they were a little busy with a newborn baby, actually. So, I kind of said, well, okay, that's a pretty good excuse for canceling a session, fine, and then they rescheduled. And, Courtney showed up and brought the baby. It was pretty cute, I have to tell you. Mm-hmm. They were just like any pair of, googly goggly parents with a newborn baby. It was way too cute. They just said, call our management and bill them, and they billed the label, and there were no questions asked. I mean, this was after Nevermind, so the money was there, and this was word of mouth recording. I mean, we're talking, maybe $1,000 or something. It wasn't much of a bill, for a couple of days. It was trivial it was peanuts as far as the label was concerned. Mm-hmm. A, they were demos, and B, the other thing is nobody really cared. The tapes actually sat on the shelf for a couple of years. And I eventually, when the studio closed in 93, I had to call him and say, look, can I send these tapes to somebody? I mean, nobody ever asked for the demos. The band walked out with a cassette, I think. But nobody was in control, it seemed like. I did the recordings and was waiting for somebody to go, hey, can we hear them? And I never heard a thing. It was odd. It was a strange session. I think it was more just for the band to get the songs into their heads, really, than for any other purpose. I'm not sure that anybody at the label was, I never heard a damn thing.
Do you know why the band specifically wanted to record with you those demos? Would you happen to know?
They were still, based in the Pacific Northwest, if you will, and I was familiar and friendly and easy to deal with, so, and required the minimal amount of effort and travel. Yeah. And I think they felt a little overwhelmed with the whole recording process for Nevermind, and, having to travel to the Midwest and deal with people they didn't know, and, the guy there, and they love Butch, and then, having some guy in LA mix it and, going through that whole, I think they wanted to do something quick and simple and easy at that point, hence calling me up and saying, hey, we want to record some songs on the 8-track machine. Now, I was under no illusions that I was recording the next Nirvana record at that point. I knew that they were just going to bang out some demos. So I was hoping they would at least, finish the vocals. But, I think Kurt left and he said, oh, yeah, we'll come back and finish the vocals later. And they never did. And nobody ever called for the tapes. So it was a strange session. Yeah, this was, they weren't called the In Utero Demo sessions because, of course, there was no In Utero yet. This was in, 92, I think? A full year and a half, I think, before In Utero was actually released. Yeah, they came in and they said, at this point, reciprocal recording was closed. The building still had a recording studio in it, which was called Word of Mouth Recording. And it was different equipment, but we still had the old reciprocal recording 8-track machine in the building. And Krist and Kurt specifically wanted to use the 8-track machine just for old time's sake, plus, because A, I think they knew they were demos, and B, they enjoyed the sound of it. And I think they recorded, I'd have to look at my own diaries and notes to really say this definitively, because I remember waiting around a whole day and having the band finally show up in the evening sometime.
Was that the first time you met Dave Grohl, those sessions?
I think not. I think the first time I met Dave Grohl was at the Crocodile. And I seem to remember, I don't even think it wasn't even a Nirvana show. He just happened to be hanging out at the Crocodile Cafe. I think that's the first time I met him. And so, him and Chris were hanging out or something, and someone introduced me. I don't remember much about it, but I'm pretty sure I met him briefly before that. And that was the only other time. And other than decades later in Brooklyn at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame thing, I don't know if I saw him again. I wasn't that happy with Chad's drum kit. It didn't record that well. I didn't like the sound all that much. There was a little too much hi-hat bleed on some things.
So you mentioned Chad Channing right now. For me, as a Nirvana fan, I always... first of all, I felt bad that he wasn't inducted to the Hall of Fame. I really felt he should have been. Secondly, I feel like he's kind of overlooked because all the credit to Dave Grohl, he's a monster drummer. He's one of the best drummers out there.
How you compete with Dave Grohl?
Exactly,
He's everywhere.
Exactly. But I feel like because you're competing with someone who's like Dave Grohl, he kind of gets overlooked. As a drummer, from your experience working with him, was he a good drummer to work with?
Yeah, he was great. He's artistically a very good drummer. He's got a good pop sense. As Dave Grohl has pointed out repeatedly, he was playing a lot of Chad Channing's drum parts on Nevermind because the band had demoed a lot of that material while Chad was still in the band. And Grohl has given credit where it's due to that, because a lot of the drum arrangements, as it were from Chad. I think the time when you can really hear Dave Grohl playing Dave Grohl drum parts is on In Utero.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Scentless Apprentice being the best example. You know, that's freaking, there's Dave being Dave, you know.
Yeah.
It starts with a drum pattern that's completely iconic. So, yeah, Chad doesn't get credit, but Chad, he was not as ambitious as Dave, and nobody plays as hard as Dave. I mean, I don't know how his limbs and joints and muscles can withstand that level of intensity, really, because Chad's a pretty good drummer, but Dave is an animal. So, you know, it's just different people doing different things. Chad has played in a number of other projects years later that I have recorded, actually, where the drumming is marvelous, including some of the songwriting, because Chad is actually a songwriter as well. People don't realize that. He has a couple of albums under the name Before Cars that are pretty nice tunes on those records. He's a pretty good singer. He plays bass well. Yeah, different destinies. What are you going to do?
Yeah, for sure. But, you know, I mean, thankfully, from what I've seen, you know, various interviews here and there, it seems that the split with Nirvana was amicable.
More or less. I mean, you know, I think they were just going in different directions. I know Chad wanted to contribute some songwriting, and that wasn't going to happen. You know, it's just whatever. They were after something else. Mm-hmm. Now, you know, they didn't just end up with Dave Grohl initially. They did a tour with Dan Peters. They called up they called up Dale Crover and did a tour with him. So there was a transitional period in there while they were still trying to decide who was going to be in the band. Mm-hmm. So, and, you know, they had to sort of check out these other people. And, you know, it's like, okay, Dan, well, he's great, but he's not quite what we're looking for. Okay, Dale, he's great, but he's in the Melvins, you know. And I wish I'd seen that tour where they played. I think it was in 1990 where they did a tour with Dale. It would have been interesting to see Dale.
I think it would have been the latter end of the summer of that year.
Probably before they went in the studio with Dave Grohl.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know if the latter ended. When did they record Nevermind?
They recorded Nevermind in the end of May, early June 91.
Okay, so yeah, it would have been toward the end of 1990 then, probably. Much later, when the Deluxe Bleach came out many years later, I reminded Sub Pop that they had a complete live show with Chad Channing on drums recorded at the Pine Street Theater in Portland, and I believe it was from early 1990. And we pulled out the tapes, and I made a mix of that entire show, which is essentially on the double vinyl version of the Bleach reissue. That's the second disc. So sometime in 1990, Chad was still playing with them. And then after that, we'd have to talk about the session that I did with Dan Peters on drums, which was just Sliver, one song. And then I think they did a few shows with Dan Peters. The Motorsports Garage here in Seattle gets mentioned. I was not at the show. And then they did some kind of tour with Dale Crover. Again, I don't know the exact dates. Mm-hmm. I didn't see those shows. And then he joined the band and they recorded Nevermind.
This is an open-ended question. Of all the songs you've recorded with Nirvana, was there any one in particular that you were most satisfied with how it came out, the recording?
Floyd the Barber, probably.
Really?
Yeah.
And if I may ask why?
The drum sound. I wasn't that happy with Chad's drum kit. Dale, on the other hand, had a very, very good drum kit, and he knew how to tune it and play it. I mean, he was an exemplary drummer. Now, Chad is a pretty damn good drummer himself, but Dale is one of the top drummers in the world, in my estimation. And I mean, he's up there. He's a monument. And even in 1988, Dale was an amazing drummer with a very good sounding kit, and he knew how to tune it. So the thing is, if you're recording on 8 tracks, you only have a few channels to use for the drums. So you can't rely on technical trickery to make the drums sound good. You have to get the sound at the source. It has to be a good sounding kit played in a well-balanced manner. And that is what I had with the songs with Dale, is, you know, just 5 or 6 microphones submixed onto 3 or 4 channels, sounded great because he was a good drummer and he had a very, very good sounding drum kit. So that made my recording sound a lot better than an 8-track recording, because it sounded like I had recorded the drums with some full multi-track, array of microphones and technology, and it was really just a great sounding kit. The drums make a lot of difference. So from a technical angle, I like the way Floyd the Barber and Paper Cuts sound. Also the fact that I was allowed to remix those specifically for the Bleach record, rather than using the original rough mixes we had made on January 23rd, which is what went on the INCESTICIDE record, was those original mixes that took about 10 minutes each. Floyd the Barber was originally part of those sessions, as was Paper Cuts, but those 2 songs are not on INCESTICIDE. They were on Bleach from the get-go, but I was allowed to mix them more deliberately because it was part of the Bleach sessions. Like at the time we were doing Bleach, I think they actually did a version of Floyd the Barber with Chad and decided not to use it because we all, even Chad, we agreed like, no, we can't beat the version with Dale Crover on it. Let's just use that one. And Paper Cuts, I don't know if they ever even played that with Chad. They didn't try and record that. They just said, now we'll just use the Dale version of that one too. So I had a chance, and I'm pretty sure that Kurt added a backing vocal to Paper Cuts during the Bleach sessions. There's a harmony on it, yeah. And so then I, mixed it again from there. So those were, as we were doing Bleach, the plan was to borrow those 2 songs. Now, Beeswax got added later. It didn't get remixed. It's just the straight up mix from January 23rd, as far as I remember. It might be a different mix than the one that's on INCESTICIDE. You'd have to compare them side by side in order to tell. And since they were mastered at different times by different people, who knows? Plus one is probably from a backup safety copy and one probably isn't. Who knows about that either? I don't know.
When Nevermind blew up the way it did it catch you off guard, or was there anybody expecting it to take off like that?
Nobody was expecting it to take off like that. We knew they were a good band, but nobody was expecting Smells Like Teen Spirit to take off like it did. And that was one of the songs they had not demoed before. I had heard the demos that they did of some of the songs with Chad Channing. Kurt gave me a copy of it. They demoed some of the songs for Nevermind while Chad was still in the band. So this would have been, 1990, when they were trying to get a deal to get off Sub Pop and get onto a bigger label. They were handing out cassettes of some of that material because they somehow convinced Sub Pop to send them out to record with Butch Vig while Chad was in the band. And they didn't record a full album. I think Sub Pop thought they were making the follow-up to Bleach, but they only recorded 6 or 7 tunes.
8 songs.
8
I think
songs?
this was April of 1990. They did this in Madison, Wisconsin.
Yes, they did 8 songs, not all of which ended up on Nevermind, because I think Sappy was one of them, and maybe there was another one that didn't get used. But they ended up using that as a demo to shop to try and get off of Sub Pop. And they gave me a copy of it. I had a cassette of it, actually. There it is. The song's pretty much arranged like they are on Nevermind. I think one of them has a different title and lyrics. It might be Pay to Play. I think that became Stay Away. So that one changed. But otherwise, they were much the same. That was as much as I knew. They did not record Smells Like Teen Spirit on those demos. That was a newer song. So I don't know if Dave Grohl is actually playing Chad Channing's drum parts on Smells Like Teen Spirit, because I don't know if there ever was a version with Chad. You'd have to ask Chad that question.
I don't think there was. I think you're right about that.
Yeah. But yeah, when they made it big, it was pretty exciting because, everybody knew, okay, this is the band from Seattle that knocked Michael Jackson off the #1 spot on the album chart. Yeah. When has that happened before to a Seattle band? You have to remember, at the time, we did have other bands, and the Seattle Explosion was underway. We had major label albums already in existence from Soundgarden. I think Soundgarden was on their second major label record at that point, which was Bad Motorfinger. Pearl Jam was just coming out. Alice in Chains was about to have their second record. Screaming Trees had been signed. I don't know if the Sweet Oblivion had been released yet. Not Sweet Oblivion. It was Uncle Anesthesia was the first Screaming Trees major label record. But sometime around that period, we had a bunch of Seattle bands all getting signed and making major label albums. And it was Nevermind that went to the head of the pack. But they were not the only Seattle band that was part of the signing frenzy that was making waves at that time. Mm-hmm. These other bands had sort of prepared the way, if you will, set the scene, softened everybody up for the idea of Seattle rock bands being on the album charts. So, and Mudhoney came along got signed around the same time. So did Tad, with varying results. Mudhoney did make 1, 2, 3 major label records, I believe.
I'm not sure.
Something like that. I did the middle one, which was My Brother the Cow. And then they've been happily on Sub Pop after that.
So just in terms of the community here, from what I understand, kind of in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a feeling that if anybody was going to really blow up, it was going to be Mudhoney. Is this correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so when it was Nirvana, what was the reaction in the scene here?
People were pretty delighted, actually, because the idea was like, it couldn't happen to a nicer bunch of guys, mm-hmm. And, Mudhoney, frankly, they would not argue with this. They weren't doing anything that you could really call commercial in the sense of what was happening mm-hmm. on the radio at that time or since or before. I mean, Mudhoney is not an overtly commercial enterprise, mm-hmm. And was never intended to be overtly pop music. Mudhoney is Mudhoney. It's its own thing. Nirvana, for what it's worth, was attempting to do something a little more simple, direct songwriting, pop melodies with punk rock muscle behind it. So there was kind of a punk rock aesthetic going on. I don't know. I can't really explain this. I think I just explained it as best I can. Mudhoney was not trying to write hits. In fact, I think they would laugh at you. So Mudhoney did save Sub Pop from bankruptcy. That is true. Because Mudhoney was becoming very big. And to this day, they could tour anytime they want to and come back with money. And I will point out, they have survived alive and healthy and unscathed for 30 years, which is that's a worthy accomplishment to still have your health and your songwriting ability and your artistic credibility. After going through all that, mm-hmm. I got to give it to Mudhoney for sticking it out. And Nirvana was more like a giant meteor flaming across the sky,
Mm-hmm. When I first came here, like a few hours ago, you mentioned that sometimes people overlook Bleach, even though those of us who are Nirvana fans know it's really important. Does that ever bother you at all?
No, not really. I mean, it's it's kind of the gift that keeps on giving in a way. It didn't. The record that changed the world was Nevermind. Because it was on a major label, it had those songs written for it. It was the right moment in time. Bleach was really the precursor. It was the setup. It was the foundation. It was the, putting the door open, getting your foot in the door is what it was, Bleach is not Nevermind. It doesn't sound like Nevermind. It's a different iteration of the band. It's a different artistic intention. It's a hard rock record. It's not a pop record except for About a Girl. Mm-hmm. The intent was different. So it's the Bleach version of Nirvana. It's that version of the band. Mm-hmm. It's complete and consistent in and of itself. But, I mean, it was not intended to be a world-changing record. Mm-hmm. So I'm just glad it sounds as good as it does, considering how quickly we made it. I've said that before.
Yeah. What did you think of Nevermind as an album? Because it's very polished in comparison to both Bleach and In Utero. Did you enjoy that record?
It's the least interesting Nirvana record for me. The production puts me off a little bit. It's a little too safe. Aside from the first two songs, I was never that interested in the record musically. Because the songs have never appealed to me as much. It's like a little bit lightweight. The production's a little too polished. It just feels a little too perfect to me. I enjoy In Utero much better because it feels like the actual band that I remember. And Nevermind feels a little bit like one step removed from the band as I remember them. It's a little too perfect, you know. But Teen Spirit, the whole reason the record exists is that song.
If that song, I guess if that song and if the record in general it hadn't been as polished, quote unquote, do you think it would have been as successful?
No.
So do you think it was necessary for them to go down that pathway? Necessary just for purely just commercially, I'm just speaking.
Purely commercially, it probably was necessary for that to happen if you accept the premise that it was intended to be commercial and get airplay on the radio. Because even for the standards of the time, that was a very raw record. Even by the radio standards of the time, that was a very dry, very raw, very unproduced record. Now, to our standards as indie rock people, that was a very slick recording. But I remember at the time hearing it on the radio and thinking, well, this is a little rough around the edges for something to be on the radio. I wonder if it's going to succeed, you know? Because I remember hearing Teen Spirit for the first time and thinking to myself, oh, his voice cracks at that one spot. I wonder why they left that in. Because you weren't used to hearing that sort of thing on the radio. That kind of thing never got through. It always got fixed. You know, it was always perfect. What you heard on the radio was flawless and smooth and you know, didn't have rough edges. And Teen Spirit has some rough edges in it, in the singing that we don't even notice now. They're just so, you don't even hear it. Even now when I hear the song, I don't hear anything. But I remember at the time hearing it and going, oh, they let that little thing through. Interesting, you know. They let his voice break right there at this one spot. And I don't even know where that spot is now. Mm-hmm. So it was considered raw by a lot of people at the time. And we say the production, but I think a lot of what we think of as the production is actually the mix. Mm. And the mix was not Butch Vig. The mix was Andy Wallace in Los Angeles. And Andy Wallace was a very established, very much kind of record business establishment sort of mixing engineer who does marvelous mixes. I mean, you know, those Rage Against the Machine records, they sound incredible. One of my favorite Faith No More records, King for a Day, was mixed by Andy Wallace. The guy has an outstanding resume of incredible records that he's mixed. So, you know, he applied the... Now, I don't know if drum samples were used. I have no idea. I've never got this question answered. I don't know if drum replacement was done during the mix. Someone else might know that. I have no idea. I've always been curious. Because Dave Grohl is one guy who you don't need to replace his drums. But for a big record production, you know, I don't know. I just don't know what they did. But I think a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about the production, and a lot of what people talk about when they talk about how something is produced, what they mean is how it sounds. And 60% of how it sounds is probably, you're probably hearing the decisions that the person mixing it made while they were mixing to present it in this way instead of that way. Mm-hmm. You know, obviously it has to be a good recording. The artistic part of it is the responsibility of the record producer. He gets the performances as good as they can be and captures the sounds, if he's an engineer, captures the sounds as good as they can sound. Mm-hmm. But the person who puts it all together into a thing that jumps out of the radio, that's the mixing engineer. So the mixing engineer is actually responsible for a lot of that slick feel that we comment about sometimes. So Butch Vig, the guy who did Killdozer, Andy Wallace, the guy who did Rage Against the Machine, you know, which one is going to make a slicker mix? Yeah. I mean, I couldn't have mixed it, you know, like that. I probably would have made it sound more like In Utero if I was the one mixing it. It's an aesthetic decision that you make. So, yeah, Nevermind had to be slick in order for the radio programmers to accept it. Mm-hmm. Because that was what the major label was trying to have happen.
That's very interesting.
It's unfortunate. I mean, it would be interesting to hear a remix of Nevermind someday. Kind of the way they like the Let It Be Naked thing that they did with the Beatles. Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear somebody do that with Nevermind. It would be entertaining.
Maybe you could do that.
Don't hold your breath.
When did you first hear that Incesticide was like coming together? I read that Krist gave you a call and asked if you had any other songs. Like, is this correct? Like, how did the process start with getting Incesticide together?
They needed a record after Nevermind. They needed something to be out that year. And they weren't ready to make a new record yet. They just weren't. Mm-hmm. You know, as you can see by, in October of 92, they only had 6 songs ready. So they weren't ready to record until the following year. But the label was asking, they said, okay, we've got to capitalize on this. Nevermind blew up. It's huge. We need to put something out. So someone made the decision to gather all the singles and B-sides and unreleased material together as kind of a stopgap. And I may have made the call myself to remind them that I had an outtake from Bleach sitting on the shelf, which was Big Long Now. Or possibly Krist called me and asked me what I had. But I remember specifically bringing that up because they had forgotten about the song entirely. So that's the best of my recollection right now. I don't remember who made the phone call, but I do remember that I did have to remind them that it existed, and it got added to the very tail end of Incesticide. That's the last song on side 2.
I don't even really consider that a compilation record, even though it is. Like, to me, I just consider that part of the chronology of Nirvana releases. For you, how do you compare Incesticide to Bleach? Which record do you prefer, if you prefer one?
Well, I prefer Bleach because Incesticide really feels like 2 different records to me. It feels like half of the Dale Crover record on side B and then some later odd stuff on side A. It's to me, Incesticide is a little bit, doesn't quite cohere because the Dale demo stuff is so different artistically from all the stuff on side A. Sliver and those other tunes are much more sort of pop tunes. To me, as a record collector geek, I always think in terms of like the 10 songs from the Dale demo, including Pen Cap Chew is the song where the tape ran out.
Yeah.
I would have taken all those 10 songs and just called that Nirvana album number 0. I would have taken Bleach minus Floyd the Barber and Paper Cuts and put Big Long Now and Blandest on there, and then you could say, and maybe the song from Sub Pop 200, and you could say, okay, here's the entire Bleach session, and here's album number 1, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But that's not how things ended up. So, various songs from various sessions are scattered across these different releases, and to me, it's a little strange trying to get a feel for when things happened, when you've got some songs here and some songs released years later, and some songs on the box and some songs on, Utero Deluxe and whatever. But that's how these things wind up. You can refer to the Hendrix estate for this kind of confusion as well. Yeah. People decide to release things at different times.
Incesticide was released by DGC Records on December 14th, 1992. Nevermind was released on September 24th, 1991, and In Utero was released on September 13th, 1993. Thus, Incesticide was the record which gapped the bridge between Nirvana's second and third studio albums. Now, 2 years in between studio albums is not a very long time, but as Jack mentioned, considering Nevermind had blown up, it made sense for there to be another release before too much time passed. Incesticide consists of 15 songs, these songs having been recorded at various points throughout the years. Several of the songs on Incesticide had already been out on various other Nirvana releases. As a matter of fact, 9 of the 15 songs on Incesticide had already been released. Only 6 of the songs on the record had not previously been released. The 6 previously unreleased songs on the record are Hairspray Queen, Aero Zeppelin, Big Long Now, and the Maida Vale studio versions of Been a Sun, New Wave Polly, and Aneurysm. This most recent interview I did with Jack Endino was my second interview with him. Here's a clip from my first interview with Jack, where he discusses how some of the material he recorded with Nirvana ended up on Incesticide. How did your relationship start with Nirvana?
I'm pretty sure they heard some of the early Soundgarden recordings I had done, which ultimately became the Screaming Life record.
Nirvana heard that EP?
Yes, yeah. I think they would have heard that. They would have heard the Screaming Life EP, which I think came out in late 87. I could be wrong, but I think so. They called me in 1988, January 1988, and Kurt called, and he just wanted to come up and record a few songs, make a demo basically, and they didn't have a band name. And Dale Crover was playing drums with him at the time, just as a fill-in drummer. They didn't have a permanent drummer. And of course, Dale knew me. I'd known the Melvins for quite a while. Skinyard had played with them a few times. And Kurt, of course, being from Aberdeen, didn't know a lot of people in Seattle at the time, I don't think. But Dale probably, I'm thinking Dale maybe gave me a recommendation. I don't really know that. But Dale knew what I was doing and knew my band and knew the records I was making. And also, I'm pretty sure that Kurt heard some of the Soundgarden recordings I'd already done. At least so I've been told. Again, the internet, there's a lot of information out there. Make what you will of it. But in any case, he seemed to know that I was the guy he wanted to record with right then. So they came up and recorded 10 songs with me on January 23rd, 1988. And we recorded and mixed all 10 songs in 5 hours, basically one afternoon. And some of those songs in that actual form, and I mean, I spent about an hour per song. No, 15 minutes per song mixing those songs, because I think we mixed the 10 songs in, just over 2 hours. Those mixes are the ones that ended up on Incesticide.
Really?
Yeah, which always made me think, gee, maybe if if somebody gave me a chance to, spend an extra
10 minutes,
2 or 3 hours, maybe those mixes would be even better than they are. But they're not bad mixes; they're all right. I knew what I was doing at the time, so they don't sound bad. But I know I could have made them a little bigger, beefier, or whatever. But nobody complained.
Did you know that they went ahead with the label went ahead with making Incesticide? Were you notified of this?
Yeah, later on, of course. Yeah, of course I was. I was, and they just went ahead and used it, and I had nothing to say about it. They'd already made the decision.
When it comes specifically to Kurt's screaming, I think Bleach is the best sample of how intense his screams could be. Does it take a certain technique to be able to scream like that, or how is he going about doing that?
It's not a technique thing; it's a natural thing. You either have it or you don't. It's your voice does it, your throat does it, or it doesn't. I mean, yeah, it's a technique, but I mean, he didn't have enough practice or live experience or anything else to have anything that you would call a technique. He was just natural. He had a good scream, and I was very impressed with it right from the get-go. I thought, this guy's got a great scream. He's got a good voice. I could tell that he had an interesting ear for melody, because what melodies there were interesting melodies and didn't always follow the guitar riff. So there was a little bit of thought in it. So you could just tell that he had a natural rock scream that was really good. And that was obvious right from the first chorus of If You Must, as you immediately, you'd go, whoa, okay, listen to his voice, going up a notch here. So, yeah, I liked his singing right off the bat. And I believe I probably said so at the time, because I remember Dale Crover agreeing with me about that exact thing.
I guess from a technical standpoint, when you're recording someone who's screaming, do you have to set the mic up in a different way than when they're not screaming, just in order so it doesn't boom out? Like, how do you go about that technically?
Technically, if I'm dealing with somebody who screams a lot, I shy away from condenser microphones entirely, which puts me slightly on the outside of a lot of recording technique, I guess. I favor dynamic microphones for rock screamers. It just sounds more natural to me. It's less sibilant. You don't get as much sort of spitty, sizzly artifacts. What we call sibilance isn't as prevalent. It doesn't tend to be as shrill. Condenser microphones, which are generally higher fidelity, tend to be not very flattering to a lot of singers who are screamy. They can make them sound very shrill and unpleasant. Strangely enough, if you give somebody a Beta 58 or a Sennheiser 421 or just a Shure SM58 or something like that, maybe put a foam thing over it so they can eat the mic, as we say, which gives them more of a feeling just like they're on stage because they're singing like this instead of into a mic that's far away. Mm-hmm. You get the proximity effect of the microphone working in your favor, but the pop filter that's over the mic is keeping the plosives from happening. Long story short, you can set up, and I've done this many times, I'll set up like 4 or 5 microphones just in a row and I'll say, okay, sing me a couple of lines of the loudest part of the song, and we'll just go through and we'll just A-B them, and we'll pick the mic. And generally with screamy singers, it's going to be a dynamic microphone. And all the expensive condensers are going to be left behind. Now, that's just my experience. Your mileage may vary. Mm-hmm. But in Kurt's case, in 1988, most likely I just had him singing into an SM58 with a pop filter. And I might have even let him hold it in his hand. Don't think so, though, because he would not have been a hand holder. He was used to playing with a guitar, so he would never have sung into the mic with it holding in his hand. I have other people do that. Mark Lanegan sang into an SM58, holding it in his hand for the Winding Sheet record. Sometimes the simple, obvious microphone is actually the best microphone to use, even though you may want to use the $5,000 microphone. It's not always the best choice. It really depends on the voice and the technique that's involved.
Now, in terms of Kurt's pop sensibilities, another thing that I've read is that when he wrote About a Girl, he was actually at first apprehensive about possibly recording it and putting it out on the record because he was a little concerned about how the punk grunge audience might receive that song. Did you ever get that vibe from him that he was a bit uncomfortable with that song?
No, not at all. He completely wanted to do that song. He did actually kind of, he prefaced it a little bit when he was about to record it with me. He said, okay, I'm going to do something different here. It's going to be kind of more of a pop tune. And I said, great, okay, because I think he was aware that after doing the session with Dale and after doing, some of the early stuff with Chad, which was probably songs that had been left over from the period where they were playing with Dale, a lot of it was pretty heavy riff rock. That's what much of Bleach is. It's heavy riff rock in a sort of a 70s riff rock sort of vein. And About a Girl it's a straight up jangly pop tune. So yeah, About a Girl. He sort of hinted around a little bit that, maybe this was a direction he was going to be pursuing more in the future. He kind of, I don't remember his exact words, but he seemed like, I'm kind of getting tired of this slow, heavy stuff, and I'm going to start writing more stuff like this. But, so we're going to put this on the Bleach record and see what people think.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I actually find that fascinating because there are multiple, sites online, of course, internet's the internet, that says he was actually a bit nervous about putting it out there. So you're saying that was...
Well, I don't think he was nervous. He wasn't nervous with me, I don't know what he said to other people. I have no idea. In the studio, he wasn't nervous about it. He was maybe a little apprehensive that it was going to not fit with all the other material, I think. Mm-hmm. And it is kind of a singular song.
Yeah.
But, he played it fully confident, sang it fully confident, knew exactly what he wanted to do. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what he said to other people.
No worries. I just find that interesting because coming from the source, that's different from what's online. So, another example of, online can often be distorted.
No, he smiled when he said it. He said, no, now I'm going to do this other thing now. So, he said, we're going to try something different. He basically just let me know that this was going to be different than the other stuff. That was all. I think he was sort of preparing me. He's like, well, wait, I'm going to do this other thing now. Don't get the wrong idea. It didn't bother me any. It's a great song. I'm really a pop guy, actually. Nobody seems to
Really?
know that, but yeah, I kind of am. I like a big guitar riff as much as anybody, but I like a melody and I like a hook, regardless of what the style of music is.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I mean, a hook could be a really, really good guitar riff. It could be a really, really good groove, but something that sticks in your head. That's kind of the whole point. And that's kind of what makes pop music, really, is it a hook? Does it stick in your head?
The first song you guys recorded, if I remember correctly, was If You Must.
Yes.
From what I've read, apparently Kurt eventually ended up not liking that particular song. Do you know why he felt that way?
Yes, I think I do, because I think he was a little self-conscious about not being perceived as too metal or too heavy, because I think really in his heart he wanted to do something a little more pop, melodic. And If You Must is a pretty heavy song. And, possibly, the influence of having the Melvins drummer in your band would make you want to write some big fat riffs, which may have contributed to his songwriting in some way.
Your relationship started essentially with a phone call from Kurt. Is this correct?
Correct. Yes. Just like any other band, he just called the studio, asked for me, and said, hey, we want to record some songs. We only have enough money for a day. When can you get us in? And he mentioned that he was playing with Dale Crover, who was going to help out on the session. I figured, all right, if this guy's good enough to be playing with the Melvins drummer, he's got to be the real deal, because I was already a big fan of the Melvins. So yeah, we booked the session January 23rd, 1988. And they came in with Dale drumming, and they didn't have a name for the band. He just told me to put it down as Kurt Cobain. And they did 10 songs in 3 or 4 hours, all live. He did all the vocals afterwards in one take. And probably between 3 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. we mixed all of it down, mixed, if you want to call it mixing. It was just an 8-track recording. I banged out a quick rough mix for them, and they went off and played a show in Tacoma that night with Dale, which at the Community World Theater in Tacoma, which I believe, I've looked into this, and it was the only show, well, Dale said it was the only show that he actually played with them during that time period. Because later, he did a tour with them, actually, but it was like a couple years later.
So just a general question about the Dale demo session. They came around noontime at Reciprocal Recordings, and they were only there for, X amount of hours, because then they had to go to the Community World Theater in Tacoma that night for a show.
Correct.
I think you mentioned a little bit earlier when we were talking now that Kurt recorded all his vocals afterwards, as in, did they do an instrumental first?
Correct. They did all the songs instrumentally, top to bottom, 10 songs in a row. And then, yeah, it's pretty impossible with a bunch of people standing in a room with guitars and drums to get keeper vocals. For one thing, you're concentrating on your vocal or you're concentrating on your guitar, and it's very hard, unless you're very, very good at this, it's hard to get the best possible take on the guitar and the best take on the vocal at the same time, unless you're a really seasoned player, which he was not. Even for the next year, most of his shows, his singing suffered somewhat because he wasn't used to playing and singing at the same time. He just hadn't played enough shows. At that point, I don't know if he'd played any shows, maybe 2 or 3. And the other thing is that if you're standing in a room playing guitar next to a drummer, the vocal mic is going to pick up way too much drums. So it's pretty standard to have maybe a guide vocal where you have a mic out there and you sort of sing a few verses, or you just call out the cues to the band, like, hey, here's the verse, here's the chorus, okay, we're going to the solo now. And then you go back later and you do the real vocals in a nice silent room with loud headphones and a good microphone and so forth under, better conditions, really, where you can actually get a usable vocal recording. So, like most of the bands I did at that period, and still to this day, I do a lot of bands where the band sets up and we isolate the instruments as much as we can, but they bang it out live. And then we do the vocals afterwards. And the other thing is vocals can take minutes or days. It really depends on the singer.
Yeah.
How many punch-ins are you going to need to do? And Kurt was one of those, 1 or 2 takes and it's done. And I think we did most of those vocals in one take. He just went from song to song. Like there was one or two where he had to stop and think about the words for a minute. So, okay, wait a minute, let me make sure because again, all they'd done is rehearse at that point. I don't think they played live very many shows at all. The fact that he had the words memorized is impressive in itself. He probably didn't have all of them memorized. I don't really remember because I couldn't see what he was doing out in the room there, whether he had a lot of paper with him or what. And nor, I don't really remember that exactly. But I do remember he did it very quickly. And if we did more than one take on anything, I don't remember it. It's possible we did. But in any case, after about, maybe an hour of setup and 2 or 3 hours of recording, the 10 songs were recorded, and I had to just mix it quickly so they could walk out the door with a cassette. Yeah, so that was the session that yielded anything Nirvana that has Dale Crover on it that's not live is from that session as far as I know. If You Must never got released officially until the box set. Yeah, I don't know. Any artist is like that. I mean, they write things and then they change their mind, They go, well, that's not really the direction I want to be known for. Let's do this other thing instead. So that's all it was. It was an early song, I think.
Yeah.
There were certain songs like that one, like Big Long Now, which was a song we recorded during the Bleach session. I remember that one. Kurt said, oh, there's already enough slow, heavy songs on Bleach. Let's leave that one off. So I saved it, and that got used on Incesticide. There were 2 songs that ended up being remixed and put on the Bleach record later.
Do you remember which songs those were?
I don't. You can find that information easily enough. One is Paper Cuts. One is Floyd the Barber. So see, I do remember. Paper Cuts, I think Paper Cuts, Floyd the Barber, and I think there was one more song that was used as a bonus track on some versions of Bleach that is also from the Dale session. It's a little short one. Huh?
Was it Downer?
It might be Downer, it might be Beeswax. I can never remember which one it is. But it got stuck on the end of some of the versions of Bleach. Mm-hmm. And then the other songs ended up on Incesticide, possibly including Downer. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think Downer is on both the Bleach Extended and Incesticide.
Yes, and the final song, the 10th song, was a sort of truncated version of a song called Pen Cap Chew, which only exists as a verse, a chorus, and a second verse on the recording because the tape ran out. Mm-hmm. And we ended up fading it after the first chorus, I think. And that got used on the box set much later. So that was my first session with Nirvana.
And I wanted to ask you specifically actually about Pen Cap Chew. I'm glad you brought that up. So basically, as you were saying, the tape for that song ran out, so you guys didn't have a full recording of it. So you kind of had to put the fade at the end in order to make the song, I guess, salvageable.
It's like half a song now. It's like one verse and one chorus and a fade.
Yeah. So was there any other Nirvana song that essentially, for lack of a better term, like were you able to kind of polish up anything else Nirvana related?
There was, I think there was something on the live Bleach thing where I took a bass DI and reamped it through my SVT rig because something like I had the direct signal, but I didn't have the mic signal at one point in the song, and Krist was using a distorted bass, and so I said, well, I got the direct signal, I can recreate the distorted bass sound here where the mic crapped out. But something like that, but that's like, I didn't have to re-record anything or fly anything around. No, I mean, and remember, back when I was doing this stuff, we didn't have Pro Tools or any of that digital stuff. What you had was what you had. I didn't start getting heavily into doing things in the digital multi-track world until around the turn of the century, shall we say.
One of the things that just like in online Nirvana communities that there's a lot of debate about is how seriously did Kurt take lyrics? Because Kurt sometimes will say publicly he didn't really prepare lyrics, he didn't really care, but then some people say no, he was very diligent with writing lyrics. In your experience, did he care a lot about the lyrics for his songs?
I do know that during the Bleach sessions, there were a few songs that he literally had to stop and finish the lyrics for, right then and there. Or maybe he had some some lines floating around in his head, but until it was time to actually do the real vocals, he hadn't crystallized it to be like, this is what the lines are going to be. And he would have to sit down for a minute and think, okay, what's the verse really going to be? I've been singing this nonsense, but now I've got these lines in my head. Let's figure it out. So he did actually finalize some of the lyrics right in front of me when we were doing the Bleach session. And I think he did that a little bit on the Dale demo as well, but I think it was more a case of just remembering what the lyrics were that he already knew. I do know that when we were doing Rape Me for the In Utero demos, he did have to sit down, and he was actually trying some lines out while I was in the studio there, and he was running them by Courtney. He was going, what do you think? Should I use this line or that line? And she'd be like, yeah, that line. No, use this line. And she'd be like, yeah, you're right. That's a better line. So he was like, he was open to opinions, but he had the lines. He always had to sit down and go, am I going to sing it this way or am I going to sing it this way? Because there'd always be a few optional phrasings in his head,
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's fairly obvious from reading the lyrics that he spent more time on the lyrics to In Utero than he did on some of the other lyrics, because I think the lyrics just show that there's more thought in them at that point. Maybe because he was more self-conscious, which I think is very likely, because he was very self-conscious after Nevermind was a success.
Mm-hmm.
I know nothing about how he wrote the lyrics for Nevermind because I wasn't really present for that. But it did seem a little more casual during the Bleach and the Dale demo sessions. I think he had the lyrics written out, but, I don't think he was particularly self-conscious about it, and maybe not even that ambitious about it. I am impressed that he was able to write a song like School that has 3 lines in it. And is a brilliant song with only 3 lines in that song.
Yeah.
That is some economical songwriting right there that is a lesson for people, that you can tell a whole story with very few words.
When people think of Where Did You Sleep Last Night, they often think of the MTV Unplugged version. But you actually recorded, from what I understand, the original one that Mark Lanegan and Kurt Cobain did together. Is this correct?
Correct.
And what was the story there exactly?
I may get this wrong because nobody has asked me about this for a long time. At some point, there was a session where Mark Lanegan and Mark Pickrell, the drummer from the Screaming Trees, and Kurt Cobain and Krist Novoselic were going to come in and record a side project that they'd been doing where they supposedly were writing some songs together. Now, they booked the time, and then apparently they never wrote any songs together. Or as Kurt said, well, we wrote some songs together, but we forgot them all. I don't know if it ever happened, actually. Mm-hmm. But he said, what we're going to do instead is we're just going to record some Lead Belly tunes. And I thought, okay. So they came in and recorded, and I think this is when that session took place. They recorded Where Did You Sleep Last Night? They recorded Ain't It a Shame, which is on the box set, and something called Grey Goose, which I had no memory of for years and years because it doesn't have a vocal. It's literally one riff over and over again. It's not very exciting, but there it was on the master tapes when we finally pulled it out. They just, for some reason, nobody bothered singing on it that day. And it ended up on the box set, I think. That was all they managed to do that day. One song with Mark singing, one song with Kurt singing, and an instrumental. And I asked them, what do I put on the log sheet? And they said, oh, call it The Jury. I said, okay. So, but it wasn't really a band. But it was the only time I got to record Mark Pickrell drumming with Krist and Kurt. And I think that is where that version of Where Do You Sleep Last Night came from. Because sometime after that, when I was recording Mark Lanegan's first solo record, I think the subject of that song came up and we decided to just put that on the end of it. That's why that song is on the winding sheet. There's another song on the winding sheet called Down in the Dark, where we got Kurt to come in and do a backing vocal, and I'm doing a little electric guitar on it as well. Probably the only thing on which I'm playing guitar with Kurt singing that exists, which is interesting. I haven't really thought about that. Yes, but that was the version, that arrangement of the song, I think, is what inspired Kurt to do the song at the Unplugged session much later.
Really?
Probably so. Although really, Kurt was present when we recorded the Mark Lanegan version, so, I'm sure they arranged it together. Anyway, this is all speculation.
So for you, when you listen to, I guess, the Unplugged version, how does it compared to the versions that you were involved with? Like, what do you think of it?
The arrangement is the same. The difference really is the instrumentation and the vocal. He sings it very similar to how Mark Lanegan sings it, but, he puts the sort of Kurt passion into it, really.
Yeah.
Different players, different instrumentation. I think the only thing in common is, Kurt's playing acoustic on it.
When it comes to Nirvana, obviously with two superstars like Kurt and Dave, sometimes Chris gets looked over, but he was super important to that band. Working with Chris, how was he like in the studio?
Great. One take.
Really?
Yeah. He's very good. He's very natural. He knows the parts. He just does it. Chris is quick. He gets what he's doing. He's got a natural feel for melodic bass lines. Accurate player, very tight, does what he wants to do. And in later years, he got really good at playing accordion, which is not easy.
Yeah.
He's put a lot of time into learning the accordion, actually, which in his own band, Giants in the Trees, that I worked on their first album, recorded much of it and mixed it and mastered it, and then I ended up mastering their second record, too. He plays bass and accordion on those records. He's very good, and sometimes he writes big riffs on the bass. I also did 2 records for Flipper when he was in that band, which was another story entirely. Flipper were an interesting bunch of guys, shall we say.
That's cool. I was speaking a little earlier this year with Ernie Bailey, and he basically, in his view, he said the best way to look at Kurt and Krist is Frodo and Sam. That's kind of how his view of them was. Do you agree with that?
Yes. That's a pretty good way to look at it, actually, in a way. Except that Sam is like twice as big. Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it, actually. But who is Gandalf? That's the question.
That's true.
And who is Sauron?
Yeah, that is true. I am also of the theory that, we're going off topic, but they could have just taken the Eagles straight from the Shire to Mount Doom. In my view, I'm one of those guys.
Yeah, you were watching the same cartoon that I saw, actually. Yeah, why didn't they think of that? You'll have to ask J.R.R., actually.
That's very funny.
But, yeah.
By the way, I was thinking just purely on a technical level, you only had, if you break it down, you only had a few minutes per song to mix all the stuff from the Dale demo in particular.
Correct.
And you were doing it analog.
Yes.
How did you do that while having the balance is still good? It's not like the vocals are super high or this is like you managed to. How do you pull that off?
When everything is recorded in the same afternoon, all the levels are the same. Mm-hmm. You're not stopping and changing guitars and changing drums in the middle of the recording session or going to a different guitar amp or, you're basically, when you're recording a band that is essentially playing their live set right in front of you, you've got the same guitar tone from beginning to end, the same bass tone, the same levels, the same drum kit. Once you get one song mixed, even rough mixed, it's kind of a set it and forget it scenario. Once you get the sound, like this is what it's going to sound like, then you just run through all the other songs with the same settings and it's probably going to sound okay. That is how you rough mix 10 songs in an hour, is you get the first one sounding good and then you just roll the others with the same settings. It's that simple, really. That's the efficient way to do it. It doesn't work if the songs are all different from each other.
Yeah.
But that was not the case. The Dale demo was definitely the band, here's our sound, here's the set that we're going to play tonight at the Community World. I just wish I had a little more tape because there were a couple of songs that they could have recorded that didn't get recorded, that they played that night in Tacoma. Enter Exorcist being one of them, actually. It's a great tune. It would have actually been a great song on that reel if we had had a little more tape.
Did you record the version of Enter Exorcist that is the official studio version?
No. That was recorded, I believe, by John Goodmanson in 1987.
Okay.
And I believe, what's his name, the other drummer whose name escapes me right now.
Aaron Burkhardt?
Yeah, I think it's Aaron on the drums on that.
Would you happen to know if there are any plans to release any more like box sets or anything, or is that something that's like kind of, if there is, it wouldn't be publicly disclosed?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think they've kind of scraped the bottom of the barrel on this a lot. I think the only thing they have left is lots and lots of live recordings.
Mm-hmm.
So there is the possibility of more live stuff. I think some kind of live In Utero tour thing could exist because there's some pretty good recordings. A lot of them have been bootlegged. And I suspect that there are soundboard tapes in a vault somewhere of some of the shows from the In Utero tour when Pat was in the band. You know, when it's like a 4-piece Nirvana.
Yeah.
So I think some of that stuff exists. I've heard some here and there, and it was really good for live recordings. So I think if somebody really wanted to, they could come up with some more live stuff. But, you know, I don't know how likely that is at this point. What's going to happen is there's going to be like a 20-year anniversary of this or a 30-year anniversary of that. And somebody somewhere at some record company is going to be like, is there anything left that we can find, you know, one more song somewhere, you know, where is it? And then I'll get the phone call and I'll be like, yeah, there's like 1/3 of a version of Floyd the Barber on the reel with Chad, you know, or whatever. You know, it's not, you know, it's like, how much of the bottom of the barrel do you really want to scrape? I do get tired of people angling for personal stuff. I had a TV crew once that were like, they were begging me if there was any video footage of Nirvana during the Bleach sessions. I said, no, we didn't have cell phones. Nobody had a video camera. You know, I mean, they barely had a working van, you know.
Yeah.
There's a lot of still pictures. They're all in the Bleach reissue has a lot of still photos that appeared, which are great. There is also a version of Hairspray Queen with Chad Channing that exists somewhere. There isn't much.
No, I hear you, man. I hear you. In terms of remixing, you know, going back to the original session, the Dale demo, you didn't have much time to put everything together. If you could have properly mixed one song, what would have that song been?
Pen Cap Chew exists as a verse, a chorus, and a complete second verse, and the tape runs out somewhere around the first line of the second chorus. The version on the box set and the version that we put on the Dale demo at the time when I made cassettes is verse, chorus, fade. I actually, when I had access to the tapes some years ago and a Pro Tools system, I pulled it out and I was able to reconstruct a version of the song because there is a complete second verse on the reel, and I was able to basically duplicate the first chorus, paste it on there because, of course, Kurt sang the chorus is exactly the same in any case. The lyrics never changed. I heard, you know, there was a live version I was able to compare the arrangement to. So I was able to kind of reconstruct the song because the original arrangement of the song is verse, chorus, repetition of the last few bits of the chorus, and then it would end. Mm-hmm. So it's possible to reconstruct the song, actually, using the second verse that nobody's heard and a copy of the first chorus with a little section repeated. It's basically a digital reconstruction. And nobody was interested in using it. So I remember offering it as a suggestion at one point, but it is what it is. Maybe someday.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
I think that'd be really cool.
Yeah, whatever. You know, it's like, yeah. I mean, I think, like I said, there may be bootlegs of it from '87 using with the arrangement that they actually played. Because I think they played it at Community World that night.
So your first session with the band was the Dale demo. What was the following session? Like chronologically, was it the Love Buzz session?
Correct.
And how was that session? How was that experience for you?
It was Chad Channing's first time in the studio with the band. And it was a little tentative because I think he had only joined the band like a few weeks before that. Because I believe the sessions were in June or July of 1988. Because they did the session with Dale in January of 1988, and they played a show with him that night, and that was the only show they played with Dale at that time, according to Dale. And then they had Dave Foster in the band, and I actually drove down to Community World and saw the tail end of them playing a show with Dave Foster at Community World. Sometime, I'm thinking it might have been March of 1988, but then he didn't last, and they got Chad, and then Sub Pop said, let's do a single, and they came in June or July of 1988. You could look that up.
Yeah.
To do that, and they did the single, and I think 2 or 3 additional songs. Blandest, I think they did a version of Mr. Mustache. I think they did a version of Sifting. Instrumentally, there were only gibberish vocals on those. But the songs we kept were Love Buzz and Big Cheese. So that was my first session with them under the name Nirvana.
And from that session, I've read that Love Buzz originally had kind of like a sound montage at the beginning of the song. The famous sound montage of Heck, was actually the extended version of what was at the beginning of the Love Buzz single originally.
Correct. It's like 20, 30, 40 seconds, something like that. It's a good long thing. It's not something you'd want to have to wait through to get to your first song.
Yeah.
And it was something Kurt made for the fun of it, actually. I probably have a recording of it somewhere. But, and I think it's been bootlegged, although I'm not sure how or where it came from. But we only used like the last 7 or 8 seconds of it, something like that, right before the song kicks in. So it is on the 7-inch. And it was from a longer thing. And it's just Kurt with a cassette deck just pressing the record and the stop button repeatedly while recording different sources.
I think it may have been for Love Buzz. You guys, Kurt would have to press something on the cassette right at the right moment for you to record it. There was kind of this experimental project you guys were doing.
It seems to me there was something he was doing with a cassette deck that he wanted me to insert into the bridge of the song while I was mixing it. But for some reason, we did not have enough tracks on the 8-track machine to record it. So I had to do it by mixing it in while we were running the mix of the song. And I remember us doing this, but going back and listening to the single version, and this would only be on the 7-inch version, I don't really hear it. If it's there, it didn't get mixed very loud, because it was some part of the sound collage, and it was supposed to be buried in the middle of the noise section in the middle of Love Buzz. It may be in there, literally added through the board while we were mixing the song as a virtual 9th track. I remember doing this. I don't know if that is actually what made it onto the 7-inch, because I've listened and I'm like, I don't know if I'm not sure it's there. So make what you will of that. I remember doing it. I don't know if it got used.
When it comes to Sappy, from what I understand, Sappy got listed as verse, chorus, verse. There was some kind of a confusion there. Do you know what I'm referring to? What happened?
Yeah, they recorded it. The last recording session they did with Chad Channing was an odd one, because they specifically called me up and booked a session just to record that one song. And they spent almost 2 days just working on Sappy. And it wasn't the most efficient use of the 2 days, but that's what we did. And this was well after Bleach. Somewhere it says where that was recorded. I don't remember the exact dates. And that version of Sappy was never actually released except on the Best of the Box set single CD. They put that version of Sappy on there. And it's not a particularly great version of Sappy, I think. The best version, I think, is the version that was recorded as an outtake from the In Utero sessions, that I believe is the definitive version of Sappy. Now, when they recorded it with me, they called it Sappy. But there's some confusion about it being called verse, chorus, verse. But there's actually a song that's an outtake from Nevermind that they referred to as verse, chorus, verse at that time, which is a completely different song. And again, it got used on somewhere, the box set or Nevermind Deluxe or something. And And there's a few live recordings of it. The vocals are kind of gibberish. I don't know the real title of it because I don't know if Kurt ever settled on a title. It's known as verse, chorus, verse now. Kurt would reuse titles like that because it's a generic title, basically.
Yeah.
It's like calling it The Slow One. You know what I mean? That could apply to a number of songs, why you haven't figured out what the lyrics are.
Although Sappy was not released on any of Nirvana's studio records, Sappy is actually one of Kurt Cobain's older songs. The earliest known recording of the song is a home demo Kurt made back in the late 80s. Though Sappy was not released on any of Nirvana's studio records, it is on the 2013 In Utero Deluxe edition, so in a sense you could argue that it technically does appear on a studio record, but it doesn't appear on In Utero originally. It was recorded by Steve Albini during the In Utero sessions, but ultimately it did not appear on the record. Steve Albini himself has stated that he was surprised Sappy did not appear on In Utero, noting that he thinks it's a pretty good song. At one point, the song was proposed to be the 12th song on the record, right before the final track, All Apologies. The Steve Albini recording of Sappy would originally be released on October 26, 1993, as part of the AIDS benefit compilation record, No Alternative. Though on No Alternative, the song is titled Verse, Chorus, Verse. There is another entirely different Nirvana song, also called Verse, Chorus, Verse, so for that reason, there is confusion at times between Sappy and the other song, Verse, Chorus, Verse. To add to the confusion, Sappy has been known by 3 names: Sappy, Verse, Chorus, Verse, and Sad. Verse, Chorus, Verse was also considered at one point as the potential title for Nirvana's third studio record, the record that ultimately was named In Utero. One of the interesting things about Sappy is that the 3 producers who recorded Nirvana's 3 studio albums, Jack Endino, Butch Vig, and Steve Albini, each did their own recording of the song with the band. Jack Endino's recording from January of 1990 was released on the Sliver The Best of the Box compilation. Butch Vig's recording from April of 1990 was released on the Nevermind Deluxe edition, and Steve Albini's version was released on In Utero Deluxe, No Alternative, and With the Lights Out. The home demo Kurt recorded of the song was released as part of the Montage of Hex soundtrack.
Didn't you have vocals on Spank Through at some point in time?
There is a version of Spank Through. I don't think it's been released. Unless I'm tripping, because we did do a version of Spank Through. We did do a version of Spank Through in the Bleach recording sessions, or really during the summer before Bleach, but it was with Chad. There is a version of Spank Through with Chad on drums. I don't know if it's been released or not. It's been bootlegged everywhere. And yes, actually, the opening verse of the song originally had a talking vocal underneath Kurt's singing vocal. He sings, "There's a soft, relentless mountain," or whatever. I don't remember the exact words. Mm-hmm. And I remember when we were doing it, of course, Dale wasn't there, and Kurt said, "Oh, you do the talk part." I said, "Okay." So you're right. I think I am doing the talk vocal under that. And I might also be playing tambourine on that, or on some song. It seems to me I'm playing tambourine on something from some session. I don't remember anyway. Too much time has passed. But you're right. I am actually doing the talk vocal on that. I just don't know if anyone's ever bothered to release it.
That's interesting. So the version of Spank Through on Sub Pop 200, that's a different version than...
No, that is the version. Okay, it did get released. All right. Yes, okay. That's the version. Sorry, I couldn't think of it on any Nirvana release. I forgot about Sub Pop 200. Yes, that's the version with Chad. And yes, I am on backing vocals on that.
So I guess you could technically say you were a Nirvana vocalist. Technically.
I don't believe anyone has ever said that, and I don't think anyone ever will. Backing vocalist at best,
Okay. That's better than 99.9% of the rest of us.
Spank Through is one of Kurt Cobain's oldest songs. As a matter of fact, Spank Through was actually part of Nirvana's set during their first ever radio session for Chaos FM on May 6, 1987. Though at the time they were not known as Nirvana, they were known as Skid Row. The first time Nirvana performed under the name Nirvana was at one of their shows at the Community World Theater. I made a video about that first ever performance as Nirvana. If you'd like to see that video, the link is available in the description box below. Spank Through was written back in 1985 and appears originally on the Fecal Matter demo tape, Illiteracy Will Prevail. At first, that might not seem very significant, but Spank Through's appearance on Illiteracy Will Prevail actually played an important role in the formation of Nirvana. Krist Novoselic has stated that he was impressed upon hearing Spank Through, and that is one of the things which convinced him to be in a band with Kurt. Spank Through is the third Nirvana song that was ever officially released. One of the recordings of Spank Through the band did with Jack Endino, they did two. One of them was included on the compilation record Sub Pop 200, a record which also featured Soundgarden, Mudhoney, and other prominent grunge artists. Sub Pop 200 was released in December of 1988. Nirvana's debut single Love Buzz, including the B-side Big Cheese, was released in November of 1988. To date, there are 4 known official demo and or studio recordings of Spank Through. The version which appears on Illiteracy Will Prevail, which was also released as part of Sliver The Best of the Box, the first studio version which was recorded as part of the Dale demo with Jack Endino, the second version with Jack Endino which appears on Sub Pop 200, that was recorded in mid-1988, and the final known studio recording of the song took place on October 26, 1989, as part of the band's BBC session with producer Dale Griffin. That version is available on Nirvana's YouTube channel. There are also a few notable live performances of the song, the most well-known one being Nirvana's performance of Spank Through as part of their set at Reading in 1992. And of course, as mentioned, when it comes to live performances, Spank Through was part of Nirvana's set during their first ever radio session for Chaos FM.
Do you have any funny stories from the band?
When my band Skin Yard was doing our last tour, which was a tour of Europe in October, November of 1991, toward the end of our tour, we had a show. Somehow our booking agents got together and we got added to a bill with Nirvana at a club called the Arena. It wasn't an arena, it was a club. It just was called the Arena in Vienna, Austria. And it was Nirvana and Urge Overkill, and Skin Yard got added as the opening act. And interestingly enough, we hadn't seen them in months, and this was after, it was a club show, but it was packed and fully sold out because Nevermind had just been out for like a month or two, and everyone in Europe knew about it. Mm-hmm. The band was blowing up like right then. But they had to finish this club tour they were doing. And our equipment had been stolen in Rome a couple of weeks, maybe a week or so before that. Our guitars were stolen out of our van. So we had finished literally the last 4 or 5 shows of our tour. We had to use borrowed guitars from whatever opening band played with us because we were doing our own headline tour. But this one show, we got added to the Nirvana bill. And we had no bass and no guitar. And so we had to basically say, hey, can we borrow? And Nirvana was going to let us use their equipment. But Kurt's guitars were all left-handed. Oh. And he was ready to give me a guitar. He was going to give me one of his, Jag Stangs or whatever the heck he was playing, but it was a lefty. He said, well, I can have my tech flip the bridge around for you, but we were sound checking right then. I was like, come on, so, and Krist offered to let our bass player, Pat, use one of his basses, but Krist, being somewhat tall, needed 2 guitar straps duct taped together end to end because he likes to play the bass low, plus he's really tall. So his bass had 2 guitar straps end to end, also duct taped to the bass itself, so the strap wouldn't come off. So I remember he put it on our bass player, who is tall but not excessively tall, and the bass hung, somewhere below his knees. And we all had a good laugh about it, actually, and then we went to Urge Overkill and begged them very nicely if we could borrow their instruments, for our show. And they were I suspect they had heard a little bit about Nirvana smashing equipment, and they kind of thought, oh, here's another Seattle band. And they were very now you're not going to damage these instruments, are you? They were very do not smash our guitars, and we're just like, no, that's not our thing. We're very respectful. I've been playing the same guitar for 5 years. I had to, because, the guy in Urge Overkill, he had a nice Gretsch guitar that he let me play for our show. And, I just had to sort of ease his fears that we were not another Seattle instrument smashing outfit. So, Urge Overkill very kindly let us use their guitar and bass. And we had one more show with Urge Overkill, I think the next night in another part of Austria. And they let us use their instruments. But that was funny, actually. The Nirvana people were ready to help out, but it wasn't going to work.
Yeah. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what you see, make sure to subscribe for more. All the videos on this channel are original. I'm the one conducting all the interviews and editing all the videos together. So if you guys like what you see and you want to support, the best way to do so is honestly just to subscribe. Lots more to come.